All right, so I'm gonna get started. Today we're going to be talking about the lay critique. I don't have like a slideshow or anything for this, so I'm just going to kind of like go through my thoughts on it. It's going to be more of a rant. And we're going to talk about going for the critique in front of lay judges. So let me know if any of you have questions. You can find my email on the wiki and you can reach out to me there. Um, Otherwise, pop it in the chat, whatever you want. So, first of all, like broadly, what is the lay K? In this presentation specifically, the lay K means an argument grounded in critical theory that is designed to be read in front of a parent or otherwise lay judge. So it's pretty broad, right? It does not need to follow the link, impact, alt framework sort of like style of a critique, nor does it need to follow a specific like K-AF interpretation. It is just parent judge or like lay judge plus critical literature. Um, in this presentation specifically, we're going to talk about both the AF and the neg, but we're mostly going to talk about the neg. I'm going to talk about how alternatives and framework and also your strategic choices will look a little bit different when going for the lay K than when you were going for, the K more traditionally. So I think the first big question to tackle is when should someone read the lay K? My like blunt answer is that the lay K in sort of more like prelim, you have a single tech judge or a single lay judge sort of rounds is not very strategic. I think that about 80% of the time, the lay K is weaker than a more traditional policy-oriented approach. So like whatever your normal like lay implementation of the resolution is good. We need to like stop fanning the flames or like whatever your scenario is. That should probably be what you go for in most prelims with lay judges. That said, and there are a few reasons for this. So I think the first one is that lay judges have been taught to be afraid of critical arguments. I actually think that this is the biggest one. A lot of lay judges are trained by their students, by their children, by other parents, by tech judges, things like this, that the K is something to be afraid of. I think this is also an issue that affects tech judges. And I think that this is kind of an unfound, like, this is silly because in my mind, I think that the K is not inherently more complicated than a policy-oriented debate style. It is just we have been trained more to focus on these policy-oriented debate styles. Um, the second reason that I think that in most scenarios, the lay K might not be as strong as the like more traditional policy lay approach in front of a single prelim judge is that these arguments are often really complicated and they require more explanation than you often have time for in a lay round. Give me 1 second to fix the view. Awesome. So I think that that is the like second big reason that these are less strategic. But I don't necessarily think that this is a kill shot either. I just think that there's a lot of concepts that require a lot of explanation, and we don't always have time for that explanation in these lay rounds. The third big reason is that lay judges sometimes just believe that these should be like topics are about policy terms. I think this is similar to the first reason, but like sometimes lay judges are just like, this is debate, we're talking about a policy. But that said, I think that there are a lot of benefits to these rounds. So I think that these are often very strategic. They're just strategic in specific instances. So yes, the lay K is not often the best strategy in front of an individual lay judge in prelims. But I think that there are instances in which the lay K is by far the best strategic choice. This applies doubly for people who are normally K debaters. Like if you usually go for the K, you should prepare your strategy to be able to go for the K as much as possible. The first instance in which I think that these are incredibly good is on a panel. So I think in order of like strategicness, the best panel for these are one split round robin panels, like one lay, one tech round robin panels. The lay K cooks. Excellent, excellent position. Um, I think the next one is probably one tech, one or is probably like two tech, one lay. Um, these are really good on two tech, one lay, especially if you're concerned about being able to pull both of the tech judges. If you're confident in both of the tech judges, you can just go after it. But I think you do want to 3-0 as much as possible because that gives you as much buffer as possible. And I guess it also looks good on your record. So like two tech, one lay are really good for this. But then it doesn't necessarily need to be quite as lay of a K. One tech, one lay, one like in between judge, also pretty good because you can try to pull the tech and then use the lay K to pull at least one of the other two, depending on how you orient it. Um, and then two tech, one or two lay, one tech. This is also doable. This is the point where I think it's like about equally good to just going for a more traditional lay strategy, but I think it's highly doable. The second scenario where I think the lay K is really useful is more inexperienced tech judges. So this would almost be more of a flay K, but I think that these judges often require simpler words, simpler explanations, you cutting down on the technical portions of the debate, etc. And this can be really useful to win judges who might want to vote on the K or be interested by the K, but lack a lot of the judges that are knowledge that other judges have, right? They might not know specifically what an alt is or how framing works and operates in these debates, things like that. And so you can explain this a little bit more to them. The third thing is philosophically minded lay judges, is the term that I'm using. There's a lot of lay judges who are English teachers, who are like leftists, who appreciate creative approaches to the topic, right? Like lay judges have to watch very similar rounds over and over and over again. And maybe in front of somebody's parent, that's okay. But in front of a school like teacher or administrator or somebody like that who has read a lot about these topics, being able to tie it in is really exciting for them. And I think that people do appreciate the debate is a like activity that is based around interesting academic engagement. And so I think that philosophically minded lay judges, this can really work well on. The advantage of going for the K. I or going for the lay K. In the case of panels, and I forgot to say this earlier, I think that the biggest advantage is that winning the K on the tech is much easier for PFers to do than responding to the K on the tech in a lay way. Like that's a little bit confusing, but essentially, like I'll give you an example, right? At Emory, my sophomore year, we got up and we were reading Deleuze, right? And the panel was like one lay judge and then two tech judges who one was much better for like postmodernism than the other. We ended up winning on a 3-0. And I think that the reason why, especially we pulled the lay judge, was that we were very slow. We integrated this lay judge was like a teacher, right? And we read a position that opened with a story, and then we analyzed that story and why literature matters in the context of debate. Our opponents got up and they read a bunch of theory and they read, used terms like perm, etc. And the lay judge did not know what all of this meant. So we were able to sit back and be like, this, like this theory has less to do with the topic than what we're talking about. We meet all of the rules, things like that. You can explain that in pretty lay ways. But when everybody defaults to things like theory or to dumping like very, very technical framework interpretations, things like that on you, it's very easy to outlay your opponents. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about is that lay arguments concern how these topics affect us as debaters and affect real people, right? The Louisville project had this whole thing where they were trying to get like people off the street to judge rounds because that is applicable to our everyday lives, and so is critical theory. And I think even absent any strategic advantage, it's important to think this way because I think that inevitably debate has some educational potential, and I think that that educational potential can really be realized by making these critical arguments accessible to normal people, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's like a lot of the strategic viability of these arguments right there. And that's who it's best in front of, right? So maybe not in your prelims, unless it's like a teacher or you want to try something new and spice it up, and the judge has been indicating that. And you can also gauge how they're feeling about this by asking before the round. Now, how do we write a lake? So historically, the way that I've done it is started from a tech K and then simplified the argument from there. You don't necessarily need to do this. You can start bottom up, lay K. But I think in the same way, a lot of good lay arguments are just written by finding tech arguments that are understandable and then pulling out, or like, recutting your cards, re-highlighting them, re-tagging them, giving your arguments different names, pulling out extinction scenarios, things like that. I think that that's also very doable with the lake. Another thing that I think you could do is find things that are specifically effective on lay judges, etc. So I think that in terms of literature base, this is like something we should really be, or like you should really be thinking about. Positions I would stay away from. I don't necessarily think we need to stay away from all complicated theory, and I think this is very winnable in front of lay judges. But here are some I would stay away from. Psychoanalysis. I think this argument is kind of weird. It's not medical, but it kind of seems like it. It seems like you're analyzing your opponent in a weird way. So I would stay away from this on the lay, especially because, judges might have opinions about Freud. I'd also stay away from the security K on the way. Judges don't like being told that their beliefs are completely wrong in every way and that they've been like lied to their whole life about the way that security operates. I think that this is doable on the lay, more so than psychoanalysis, but I'd still probably stay away from it. And I'd also stay away from Baudrillard on the lay. Like, I don't really know why, but the vibes just don't seem right. Positions that have worked for me in the past. Deleuze. Judges like literary perspectives on the topic. And so I think that when we've read stuff about like Deleuze and Guattari, they have a lot to say on literature. And they also have a lot to say on how to be people and how to like they give this really affirmative and positive view of the world. Judges love that. They eat that up. The Cap K. I will say judges have lots of different thoughts about capitalism and communism, and you need to be thoughtful of this because it is a very like politically charged topic. But you are able to go for a lot of good root cause analysis and explain why your opponents are falling short. And it does very well on panels, and it's simple for tech judges and also very simple for lay judges, and you have a lot of different ways you can go for it. And biopower. I think that the concept of biopower is really scary for judges. Like, this is not something you want to happen, and it's pretty easy to explain. But it does hinge on some of the same problem, like hinge on some of the same ideas as security, and so it has problems there. I also think that non-TAFs are very good on the lay. Depends on them, but I think like wake work, etc., have been executed very successfully. And I think settler colonialism, critiques of IR, etc., could also work, but I have yet mostly to see it done. But again, like you should be thoughtful about the judge that you're reading this in front of. In terms of, individual lay judge or, two lay, one tech, things like that, you might want to stick with something that is less risky. But if you have more tech judges and you think that you can win the lay by, still outlaying your opponents, then feel free to go for one of these positions. So now, like breaking down individual components of how a case should operate on the lay. I'm going to start with the link. So I think that there are three main link pushes in these rounds that are varying amounts of like critical. So the first is links to the actual implementation of the resolution. This is a little bit like counterplan E or like disadd plus counterplan, or maybe even like a fill position sort of vibe, because you might not have a counterplan or like you might not have an alt. But I think this like alleviates a lot of the judges' concerns about whether or not you are topical. Um, and they like that. And it gets rid of some of their confusion about like, what is your perspective on the topic? What is your perspective on fiat? Things like that. Because these are things that even if judges lack sort of the experience to put words to, these are things that lay judges get concerned by in K rounds. It's like, what is going on? How do these people rely on whether the topic is implemented? Things like that. And so I think that going for the actual implementation gives you a way to be like, yes, we just think it would be bad for these philosophical reasons, which judges love, or lay judges love. Second thing is links to assumptions on the topic. This I think also works. This is generally, it doesn't need to be assumptions of the topic. It can be like assumptions, I guess, yeah, like links to assumptions of the topic. It's pretty good. Um, it's a little bit harder now because you need to be like, we should not take the topic as a starting point. We need to interrogate it first, which sometimes judges have problems with. But I also think that this is very effective in front of panels and can work kind of no matter what. And the last thing is links to things your opponents did. Depending on how egregious this is, I think this could be very lay. Like if they say something that is like egregiously offensive, it is very easy to win a lay judge, right? But I think also that if you can point out specific things that they did that show problematic parts of the debate community, like or problematic logic, this can be very effective on panels. I think that in front of an individual lay judge, you might again want to stick more toward being about the topic because they're like, oh, so like, why do I care that they did a security if they still prove the topic is good? Or like they did a biopower or whatever it is, they did a capitalism. Like maybe the judge doesn't care as much if it's something that they did. But I think that in general, this is like, like pretty effective, especially if it's like the link is pretty egregious. And if it's not, you definitely want to couple it with something maybe more about the topic. But then just be thoughtful about like, do we care about our what our opponents did or about the topic more broadly? The like general rule is that the other components are like a little bit more optional, but unless you are reading a non-TAF, you should have links on the lake. If you are reading a non-TAF, you don't really need links to the resolution in this case. I think you can maybe say the resolution is bad, so we shouldn't be debating it, or you can pull more of the like, oh, like topical debate must wait, and we must talk about like blah 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 first, which I think is historically pretty successful in front of late judges. So next is the impacts. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, right? Like you need to prove a reason why what they have done is bad. But I think that there's a few caveats. The first is you should treat it like any other lay impact. Do not go for extinction impacts in front of lay judges, right? Like unless they are very, very compelling. Be realistic. Maybe if it's the CAPK, you can be like capitalism is bad because it causes extinction, but like did their capitalism cause extinction? Probably not. And like again, these are still lay judges. Like, do not forget the policy lay rules you have been taught. If you take like if we actually take those into account, and then we make other things easier, and we talk about lay theory and things or like critical theory in a lay way, judges will like it. But I think often the problem when people read the lay K is they forget the rules or like standards for debating in front of a lay judge. The one big thing about the impact is you need to choose how to explain it. The traditional way in which we explain impacts in K rounds is not that the specific thing that they did causes extinction or causes um, every instance of violence you identify or your turn's case scenario, etc. It is that what they did is an example of a problematic system. That system is problematic because XYZ. And I think that there can be a link to impact, but if like there is linked to impact, and that is the only impact that you have. In a tech round, you'd probably lose to the perm double bind. In lay rounds, I think you have a little bit more leeway, but you should be thoughtful and choose, do their links cause the impacts, or do they illustrate the system that your critique operates? Or your like the system that your critique criticizes, critiques, right? In general, your like a lot of the advantage of K debate in front of tech judges is that you can be a little bit more shifty, right? Like you don't necessarily need to pick, oh, is my offense off of the thing that specifically they did, or is the offense off of the way in which your system operates, right? I think that in general, it is um, like good in front of tech judges to be able to be a little bit more shifty, pick it in the end, have offense off of both, things like that. You can't do that as much with lay judges. That does not mean that this is necessarily unstrategic because you have other access to, like, you have other advantages that you can go for, other things that make this position good in front of lay judges, but being shifty is not one. So you should pick a lane and stick with it. I would probably think that you get a bigger advantage of like actually going for the K and not just going for policy if you do say, you know, you have done a bad thing that is bad because the system that you have upheld is problematic. But I think that both are fine and reasonable ways to go for the position, especially depending on what the position is. The alt. So I think the first thing we need to do with the alt is choose if you want to have one. The advantage of having one is that you have a solution, right? Lay judges don't like it often when you identify a problem and you're just like, ah, it's so bad. What are we ever going to do about it? And I think that if voting neg like obviously solves it, either A, all of you like that would indicate that your impacts are to just the link, right? Not to the system broadly. Or like if voting neg like this is voting neg without an alt, or if voting neg like obviously solves it, then maybe it is that they have done something in round that's really problematic. Um, I think otherwise it will look more like counterplan, which lay judges don't always like, but it does give you the ability to solve things, and maybe they do like that, right? not having one is good because it avoids it you like your opponents being like, "Oh no, you cheated." But again, it does confer the problem of now you need to explain why what they did is bad, even absent your ability to solve it. You can make framework arguments, and we'll get to that later, which help you get around this, but it's not quite as easy to go for like you link, you lose in front of a lay judge because again, they're more like less oriented around exclusive like technical evaluation. If you are going for an alt, make it grounded in the real world. Like either, so you have to make another choice, right? Either we ground it in the world in which we are living and debating, like the world absent any resolution. Oh, you have done a bad thing, or like I'll give an example with the cap K, even though I don't think that this is the strongest example, is oh, like this is an instance of capitalism in debate. Instead, we need to turn debate into a mode of capitalist organizing, and we need to come together and use this as a way to like base build, create a party, etc. Our reading of this alt is key to educate you or like expose you to these perspectives, right? That's a very bad example, but that is like a real world example. Whereas the fiated example would be, oh, instead we should do a revolution. Instead, we're going to fiat that like we overthrow capitalism and this solves. So, like, pick one. There are advantages to both if you're going for an alt. It needs to be somewhat realistic. Both of the examples I gave, judges might doubt the ability for those two things to happen. So explain specifically how you get from the ballot to your alt happening. I think that in the same way as like, oh, voting negs should solve if you don't have an alt, voting neg should also probably help if you do have an alt, i.e., voting neg should do something materially to benefit your cause. And if you explain that to the lay judge, it will be much easier to win. Be very specific about what their ballot does. Basically, like takeaway for the framework. When you are going for framework, it is very key to not use jargon. In techier rounds, think like anything that is at least as techy as you have one lay judge and one tech judge and you're on a round robin panel. Anything that up, you should change the word roll of the ballot to roll of your ballot, but you can still say things like that, right? Just be very specific about it being them. Otherwise, if it is less techy than that, like if you're a single lay judge, two lay, one tech, things like that, I would avoid this sorts of words altogether. Just explain how debates ought to be like debated. My like personal take is lay judges would like this. They would love this because lay judges are often very confused about how to evaluate debates. So when you give them a specific paradigm for this is how we choose who wins, this should be your metric for it. That's great judge instruction for them now, right? So you should go through, explain exactly what should warrant a ballot, be a little bit more realistic than just like, oh, the role of the ballot is to vote for us. And judges will like that. Explain what the ballot does and why your form of debate is good. There is a small sliver of a scenario in which you don't need a big framing debate, right? If you are going for their links cause the impacts, alt solves them, or even their links cause the impacts, don't do that. You've just read like a filled disad, if that makes sense, basically. But then that's fine, right? You're still grounded in critical theory. You're like, wow, they've done a bad thing. They should lose for it. That's fine. But I think that framework helps also sometimes, right? So just like choose, do we want framework? I think you often do. You probably do, but you don't necessarily need it. Figure out how much or little you want to emphasize it, right? That positions yourself on a spectrum from more K to more policy. And I think that you can explain using a framework section why we should have debates in a particular way. But I also think you need to be thoughtful about the judge, right? The less experienced your judge is, or I think it's like a bell curve, right? Like if they're super inexperienced, then they would like this and they would be okay being told like, here's how we should orient debates, etc. If they're like in the middle, then maybe steer a little more clear of this. But if they're very like they're in the middle, you'd be like, if they already have set up ideas about how debates should operate, things like that. And you want to be thoughtful of that, right? Like you do not want your judge to say, oh, but I'm still going to vote this way if your position is solely contingent on you winning a very specific role of the ballot argument. But then on the like more experienced lay judge end, when they're like, oh, I'm good for everything, then they're good for everything, right? Or not really, but like then you can make these arguments and you can be like, this is how you should evaluate the round, and they'll probably be better for that. Even if they don't say I'm good for everything, if they're like, oh, like I like creative approaches, things like that, then you can probably go for this. So that's like the breakdown of how to construct a lay K. It was very broad, and this is more of just like a rant about what lay Ks look like, but that's an example. Historically, if you want to see past examples, I can think Iowa City West at the TOC has read like more lay K stuff. The other, like shameless plug or whatever it is. I've read stuff like this before. Last year, Nueva AH Wiki, I think, um, what was it? What rounds? I don't know. Durham Octas, I think, was a lay K. Emory round one was also lay. Those were both cap. Um, Nueva CG last year read lay Biopower at Bronx. And then AH 2 years ago read lay Deleuze and at Emory, and then lay cap at the Cal Round Robin. General like things that you should know. In a full lay round, right? You should speak at least as slow, but ideally slower than you would in any other lay round, right? So like if it is exclusively lay judges, or like if it's two lay, one tech, just one lay judge in the back of the room, or even probably one lay, one tech, speak as slow as you would in a lay round. These concepts are hard, and when you speak faster, it makes it even harder for your judge to understand what you are saying, right? So be very thoughtful about that. You should, in a techie round, if you need to speak faster, right? Like if it's two tech, one lay, and your opponent will just spread you out if you speak faster, then, or like if you speak slower, then like winning the two tech judges matters in that round. And you should emphasize key words and slow yourself down in the back half to pick up the lay, but you can be a little bit faster. Cross-examination. This is key time in lay rounds, and that is even more true in tech rounds. Or sorry, even more true in late game rounds. You should push your opponent on things that normal people who share the view of your critique would, right? How do they imagine the world functioning? How does your opponent imagine this? How do they think that power like operates? How should economics be organized? Things like this. These are all questions that you can push your opponent on, and you can ask them things that are intuitively crazy in their case, point out things in their evidence, etc. When they ask you questions, you have great time to explain exactly how your position operates. Choose which parts of it you want to emphasize and talk very directly in a way that the judge will understand. This is key. Try not to teach your judge more than two new words, right? Like if they need to keep track of like what deterritorialization and plane of imminence and line of flight and things like this mean, like these are concepts that take people studying hours and hours, like months, right, to understand. You can teach your judge this in very simple ways, but one, ask yourself, do I need to do this? You probably do not. These are all concepts that can be explained using simpler words. Two, if you are going to do this, then you should not do it for more than two arguments or two like concepts. If you need to do it for more than two concepts, your critique is too complicated. Lastly, you should talk to your judges or judge before the round to gauge their vibes. Read their paradigm, obviously. If they say like do not go for the K, then do not go for the K. But then talk to them. Don't say like are you, like they don't say that in their paradigm. If you go up and talk to them, don't say like, "Oh, are you good for the K?" But be like, "How do you feel about more philosophical approaches to the topic? How do you feel about debaters taking untraditional paths, things like that? How do you, etc." Ask their students, right? What is this person's like political views? How do they feel about this? Do you think they'd be good for the K? These kinds of questions are really good. And I think also if they are if their kids are well known on the circuit and they judge a lot, then it should be easier for it to be like, oh, I've debated in front of them before. They know me a little bit better. Yeah, now I think I can pull this out, right? So you've got lots of options, but be thoughtful, right? That's my general like thought process. I think that the Lake is a really cool strategic tool, and I think it is something that shows how interesting PF can be as a format, right? I think that it shows that there is potential for really interesting K debates, even despite the constraints that are put on this format. I think that it's not often as strategic as policy in front of a lay judge. Um, if it's a single lay judge in a couple of other instances, right? But I think that there are scenarios in which the lay K is probably your best option. And I think that even if there aren't, it is still a really interesting argument and a really interesting way to approach debate. So feel free to check it out. Feel free to ask me questions about this. Again, this is more like of a rant than anything else. And this form of argument is pretty new. So we're still iterating on it and figuring out how the lake best operates. And I'm interested to see what, more people like think about it, how it looks this year, next year, etc. Maybe we'll find out it's terrible. Maybe we'll realize that it's awesome, right? Yeah. Feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you all.